After years of emotional abuse, I left and found love. My ex ended up alone and miserable. These words once felt like an impossible fantasy, a desperate prayer I'd whisper to myself in bathroom stalls with tears streaming down my face. Now they're the most honest description of my life I can offer. Funny how the truth can sound like the sweetest fiction. The first time Jake called me worthless, we were standing in his kitchen. The memory still burns in my stomach, the granite countertop cold against my palms, the half-chopped onion abandoned on the cutting board, the steady drip of the faucet measuring out the seconds of silence that followed. I remember thinking it must have been a mistake. People who love you don't say such things. By the 100th time, I had stopped counting, stopped believing I deserved anything else. 8 years together. 8 years of his voice becoming the narrator in my head, his disappointments becoming my failures, his anger becoming my fault. 8 years of shrinking, apologizing, tiptoeing around his moods like they were landmines. My friends stopped calling. My family's concerned expressions grew more pointed with each holiday visit. I told myself this was normal. Relationships take work. No one's perfect. At least he doesn't hit me. The bar had sunk so low it was practically subterranean. The revelation didn't come as a thunderclap, no dramatic confrontation, no single unforgivable act. Instead, it arrived in the produce section of the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. I was holding an avocado, testing its ripeness with my thumb, when I realized I was calculating whether Jake would criticize how I selected it. Too soft, I was careless. Too firm, I was impatient. The perfect ripeness, pure luck, anyone could have picked that one. In that moment, between the avocados and the bell peppers, I saw with sudden, terrible clarity what my life had become. A performance with no applause, just the constant threat of criticism. I put the avocado back. My hands shook as I abandoned my half-filled cart in the middle of the aisle and walked out of the store. In my car, I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and drew in breaths that felt like the first real air I'd had in years. Something inside me, something I thought had died long ago, flickered back to life. I drove home with my windows down, the autumn air whipping my hair into tangles Jake would have hated. I never planned to leave that day. I had no secret stash of money, no bag packed and hidden in the back of my closet. But when I walked into his house, every object seemed to vibrate with wrongness. The beige walls he'd insisted on, the uncomfortable modern couch he'd chosen for its appearance rather than comfort, the conspicuous absence of any photos of my family. This wasn't a home. It was a monument to his control. My cell phone buzzed in my pocket. Jake. Wondering where I was, why I wasn't starting dinner, what I was doing wrong now. I silenced it and slipped it back into my pocket. The sun was setting, painting his living room in amber light. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching nothing, disturbing nothing. In our bedroom, I pulled my old suitcase from the top shelf of the closet, sending a fine shower of dust onto the carpet he insisted I vacuum twice a week. I packed methodically, emotion suspended in some distant part of my mind. Clothes, toiletries, the few pieces of jewelry that had been gifts from my mother. My laptop. The external hard drive where I kept photos from before Jake. A single framed picture of my sister and me at the beach. I left my wedding ring on the nightstand. His texts grew more frequent, then turned to calls. I let them ring out. Each unanswered call was a small rebellion, a tiny reclamation of sovereignty. I wrote a note, 3 sentences, no apologies, and left it propped against the coffee maker he would use first thing tomorrow morning. The sun had fully set by the time I loaded my suitcase into my car. Our neighbor, Mrs. Kravitz, was walking her poodle and raised her hand in greeting. I wondered what she saw. A woman leaving for a business trip? A casual evening out? Or did she recognize the look of someone escaping? I nodded and slipped into the driver's seat before she could approach for conversation. Driving away from the house where I'd lived for 6 years felt surreal, like I was watching someone else do it in a movie. The suburban streets gave way to the highway, and I merged into the flow of traffic heading west. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My throat burned with unspent tears, but my mind was strangely quiet. No internal voice questioning my decision. No catalog of Jake's potential reactions. Just the sound of my own breathing and the white noise of tires on asphalt. I drove 3 hours to my sister Ellie's apartment. She opened the door in her pajamas, took one look at my face and the suitcase behind me, and pulled me into a hug so fierce it nearly crushed the air from my lungs. No questions. No I told you so's. Just her arms around me and the scent of her lavender shampoo. When she finally released me, her own eyes were wet. The first week was a blur of practical logistics, canceling joint accounts, redirecting mail, ignoring Jake's increasingly desperate and then angry messages. Ellie set me up on her pull-out couch and went to work each day with worried backward glances. I assured her I was fine, and in some strange way I was. The relief of escape was so powerful it temporarily drowned out the grief, the shame, the wasted years. But after the initial adrenaline faded, the real work began. The endless internal tape of Jake's criticisms didn't disappear just because I'd left his physical presence. His voice followed me, into job interviews, into new social situations, into the mirror each morning. Worthless, stupid, embarrassing, broken. I'd escaped the house but brought the prison with me. Therapy helped, though at first I resisted. What was there to talk about? I'd been weak enough to stay with someone who diminished me daily, and then finally found the sense to leave. End of story. But Dr. Lin gently suggested there might be more to unpack, more to understand, more to heal. 3 months into my new life, I was working as an administrative assistant at a marketing firm, saving for my own place, and learning to identify the Jake voice in my head as separate from my own thoughts. Progress, I told myself, even when some days felt like running in place. It was at a work happy hour that I met David. He was from the graphic design department, quiet and thoughtful with glasses that kept sliding down his nose. I noticed him first because he didn't notice me. He was completely absorbed in explaining something to a colleague, hands moving animatedly, face lit with enthusiasm. Something about the unself-conscious joy in his expression made me stare a moment too long. He caught my eye and smiled, a quick flash of recognition between strangers, before returning to his conversation. Later, we ended up at the same high-top table, part of a group discussion about the latest Netflix series everyone was watching. When I spoke, offering a theory about the show's ending, David tilted his head slightly, listening with complete attention. No interruption, no dismissal, just genuine interest in what I had to say. Such a small thing, but it sent a shock through my system. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be heard. We didn't exchange numbers that night, didn't make plans. But the following week, I found a paper coffee cup on my desk with my name written on it. David was standing by the copy machine, pretending not to watch for my reaction. I raised the cup in a small salute of thanks, and the smile that spread across his face made something warm unfurl in my chest. Our courtship, such an old-fashioned word, but it fits what happened between us, was slow and careful. Coffees turned into lunches into after-work walks around the city park, walks into dinner at a small Italian restaurant where the owner knew David by name, each step deliberate, each interaction leaving me more certain that what was happening between us was entirely different from what I'd known before. The first time David reached for my hand, I flinched. Couldn't help it, a Pavlovian response to male touch that had become associated with inevitable disappointment or pain. He immediately let his hand drop. No offense taken, no pressure applied. We walked another block in comfortable silence before I found the courage to reach for his hand myself. His fingers interlaced with mine, warm and solid but holding gently, as if he understood I might need to pull away at any moment. I didn't tell him about Jake right away. Didn't want that shadow falling across this new, fragile thing. But eventually, on a cold November evening, as we sat on a bench watching the last of the autumn leaves spiral down, the story spilled out of me. Not all of it. Some wounds were still too raw to expose. But enough. Enough for him to understand why I sometimes went quiet, why certain phrases made me tense, why trust came hard for me. David listened. Just listened. No platitudes about how I deserved better. No male savior narrative about how he would never treat me that way. When I finished speaking, he simply said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." And then, after a pause, "Would it be okay if I put my arm around you?" That question, so simple, so respectful, broke something open inside me. Tears came suddenly, violently, surprising us both. I nodded through them, and his arm settled across my shoulders, a warm weight that anchored me as I cried for all the times no one had bothered to ask what I wanted. As months passed, I built a new life. My own apartment, small but filled with colors Jake would have hated. A promotion at work. Reconnections with old friends Jake had deemed not good enough. Weekend visits with my family. And David, patient and steady, never pushing for more than I was ready to give. Jake continued to text occasionally, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusatory, sometimes seemingly rational. I read them all but rarely responded. Each message had less power than the last, his words no longer reaching inside me to twist my sense of reality. "Doctor?" Lynn said this was progress, the emotional umbilical cord slowly withering away. A year after I left, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Jake was telling people I'd had a mental breakdown, that I'd abandoned him without warning, that he'd tried everything to help me but I was too far gone. The old me would have been devastated by this character assassination. The new me felt a strange detachment. His narrative no longer defined my reality. It was around this time that David told me he loved me. We were making dinner in my kitchen, something simple, pasta with vegetables, and I was chopping a red pepper. He wasn't looking at me when he said it, just stirring the sauce, commenting that he loved the way I diced peppers so uniformly. "I love a lot of things about you, actually," he said, still focused on the sauce. "I think I just love you, period." My knife paused mid-slice. I waited for the panic, the suffocation, the desperate need to escape that I'd felt in my previous relationship when things got serious. It didn't come. Instead, I felt a quiet certainty, like finding the last piece of a puzzle and watching it slip perfectly into place. I set down the knife and moved to stand behind him, wrapping my arms around his waist and pressing my cheek against his back. I could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. "I love you too," I said into the fabric of his shirt. He covered my hands with his, and we stood like that for a long moment, sauce forgotten, breathing together. 2 years after my escape, life had settled into a new normal. David and I were living together in a bigger apartment. I'd been promoted again. My friendship circle had expanded. The nightmares about Jake had mostly stopped. I still saw Dr. Lynn, but now our sessions focused more on my future than my past. It was pure coincidence that I saw Jake again. I was visiting my hometown for a cousin's wedding and had stopped at a coffee shop near my old neighborhood. He was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over a laptop, a half-eaten muffin pushed to the side. I recognized him instantly, the set of his shoulders, the way he ran his hand through his hair when frustrated. But something was different. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. I stood frozen by the counter, coffee in hand, fight-or-flight response fully activated. He hadn't seen me yet. I could leave. Should leave. But curiosity held me in place. This man had once been the center of my universe, his opinion the axis around which my self-worth revolved. Now he was just a person in a coffee shop, unaware he was being observed. As I watched, a woman approached his table. Not a date. Her body language was all wrong, too professional, too contained. She handed him what looked like a document. They exchanged a few words, her expression impassive, his increasingly agitated. She checked her watch, said something final, and walked away. Jake stared after her, then down at the document, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. I should have felt something. Vindication, perhaps, at seeing him upset, or fear that he might look up and see me. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, like looking at a photograph of a place I'd once lived but could barely remember. The emotional tether that had once bound us was gone. As I turned to leave, he looked up. Our eyes met across the coffee shop. Recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by something complicated. Anger, shame, longing. He half rose from his seat, mouth opening to call out to me. I didn't give him the chance. I walked out the door, heart pounding but steps steady. Outside, I took a deep breath of spring air and called David to tell him I loved him. Just because I could. Just because it was true. Over the next few months, information about Jake trickled back to me through our dwindling network of mutual connections. His company had downsized, and he'd been let go. The woman I'd seen was likely serving him divorce papers. He'd gotten married quickly after I left, to someone who'd worked in his office. It hadn't lasted. He'd had to sell the house, was living in an apartment across town, had gained weight, had started drinking too much. I received this information with a detachment that surprised me. There was no glee in his downfall, no satisfaction in knowing he was suffering, just a quiet acknowledgement that our paths had diverged completely and that the person I had become could never have existed had I stayed. 3 years to the day after I left, David proposed, not with a grand gesture or public spectacle, but on a Sunday morning in our kitchen, both of us still in pajamas, me with bedhead and morning breath. He didn't go down on one knee or present a box with a ring. Instead, he took my hands across the breakfast table and told me that loving me had taught him what real partnership meant, that he wanted to spend his life becoming better together, that he would understand if I never wanted legal marriage given my history, but that he was committed to me regardless. I said yes without hesitation. The Jake voice in my head, once so loud, so constant, was silent. In its place was my own voice, clear and certain. This was right. This was real. This was love that built up rather than tore down. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony with just family and close friends. My sister was my maid of honor. David's brother was his best man. We wrote our own vows, promises not of obedience or perfection but of honesty, respect, and growth. When David slipped the ring on my finger, a simple band we'd chosen together, it felt nothing like the first time I'd worn a wedding ring. This wasn't a shackle, it was a choice. 5 years after leaving Jake, my life is unrecognizable from what it once was. David and I have a small house with a garden I tend obsessively. I've started my own marketing consultancy. We're talking about children. I still see Dr. Lynn occasionally, but now it's more like catching up with an old friend who happens to have professional insight into life's challenges. Last month I ran into Mrs. Kravitz, my old neighbor, at a department store. She didn't recognize me at first. My hair is different now, and I carry myself differently too. When realization dawned, her eyes widened. She told me Jake still lives in the area, that he's alone now, his second divorce finalized last year, that he looks terrible, has let himself go, that he lost another job, that he tells anyone who will listen about his crazy ex-wife who ruined his life by leaving him, that no one really believes him anymore, that he seems miserable. I nodded and made appropriate sympathetic noises, asked after her poodle, mentioned the unseasonable weather. Didn't correct her assumption that I'd feel vindicated by this news. The truth is I don't. Jake's misery isn't my victory. I didn't leave to punish him. I left to save myself. His current state is the natural consequence of who he is, not some karmic retribution I orchestrated. As I drove home that day, windows down despite the chill, I thought about the parallel lives we all narrowly avoid. In another reality, I'm still in that house with the beige walls, still flinching at footsteps, still apologizing for existing. In this reality, I'm driving to a home where I am loved completely, to a partner who sees me clearly, to a life I've built deliberately. After years of emotional abuse, I left and found love. My ex ended up alone and miserable. These aren't just words anymore, they're the architecture of my freedom. The most perfect revenge was never about seeing him suffer. It was about reclaiming my right to joy, regardless of what happened to him. The sweetest part? I no longer need him to be miserable to prove I made the right choice. My happiness stands on its own, independent of his fate. That's not revenge. That's redemption, and it tastes infinitely sweeter.